Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today's topic is of greatest interest to those of you who run tabletop role-playing games, but any setting creator might have to ponder this question at some point. That question is, how can I integrate a character's backstory into an existing setting? RPG players come across this the most often because players control characters while game masters control settings, and they both need to reconcile with each other. But even creators who work alone will sometimes come up with character ideas and not know where in their existing setting they can put them. So in today's video, I'll be exploring 7 techniques you can use to reconcile and integrate what might appear to be completely independent story and setting elements. Some of these techniques are simple and easy to do, while others will involve some setting adjustments, and so I've sorted the techniques in order from lowest impact to the setting to highest impact. So, let's get into it. Number 1. Reinterpret the backstory. This is the first question you should always ask when you're adding a backstory to a setting. How set in stone is the backstory? How much of it needs to be exactly the way you imagined it, and how much could you change around while keeping the essence of the story the same? Because if you can change all the details and all the proper nouns while keeping all of the basic story beats and character idiosyncrasies, then you should have no trouble integrating the backstory. Let's look at an example. Say you want a character like Conan the Barbarian, but the setting is a mystical Wild West. You could say that something magic happens to move this character into this setting, but if you want to integrate the character, you should look at each of his traits and evaluate how they might fit into the setting. Conan is a big man who fights with a sword, but do you think he would switch to firearms if they were available, or would he stick with melee weapons? If he does stick with melee weapons, then maybe he uses a machete instead of a sword, since that fits with the setting. If you're going for the movie version of Conan, maybe instead of being enslaved by raiders, he was kidnapped by Mexican bandits and raised to be their servant, but all the while learning their tricks until he eventually escapes. Conan's mighty deeds would have to change considering the political situation in the Wild West, but at that point, you're finished with the backstory. Number 2. Create a new location. Maybe a character's design or personal history doesn't match up with what the setting can normally provide. But what if the setting could be bigger than what you've already laid out? If the setting's a single nation, then maybe there's another one where the character could come from. If the setting's a continent, then make another continent. If it's a set of planets, then there are always more of those in a galaxy. For instance, a setting based on a typical Tolkien-esque fantasy world with elves, dwarves, and hobbits could have another continent full of beast folk with features based on lizards, elephants, and cats. Or what if you want someone who doesn't believe in magic to enter a place where everyone can use magic? Maybe the magical kingdom of your setting is somehow isolated from the rest of the world. Or maybe the magical world of your setting contains a kingdom that's somehow isolated and cut off from magic. Number 3. Change your perspective. Sometimes the same city or the same nation can look completely different depending on a person's perspective. To a person living in a Manhattan penthouse, New York City is a beautiful place full of high fashion, national landmarks, economic bigwigs, and some of the best live performances the world has to offer. But to a person living in a tenement in Queens, New York City is grimy, dangerous, hostile, and full of high prices and low wages. Both of these statements are true, but depending on your living arrangements, only one of these statements is relatable. For this option, let's imagine that you create an idealistic fantasy kingdom whose capital is a shining jewel and whose people are chivalrous and noble. Maybe that's true, but any kingdom and any city will contain bad elements. Nobles who take advantage of their position, thieves who steal, murderers who kill, and con artists who take advantage of the vulnerable. And so a city seen as a shining jewel to foreigners and the landed classes might also be a cesspit of temptations, violence, and desperation to those who live in its ghettos. Number 4. Reinvent an existing character. Another way to insert a new character with a new backstory is to not actually do that thing I just said. Instead, what you can do is take an existing character and change their backstory to match what you're looking for. Now, obviously you shouldn't do this with a character that your audience already knows about, but maybe you have a side character who doesn't talk about their past, or who might have lied about their history. There are plenty of people who do such things in real life. Alternately, you could introduce a new character, but have an existing character be involved in their backstory. Maybe the existing character is the new character's parent or sibling, or maybe they're in some sort of mentor-apprenticeship situation. By doing this, you tie the new character into your existing stories, and you can even foreshadow the new character's arrival by having the tie-in character refer to them a couple of times. Number 5. Move the timeline. Sometimes it's the era that doesn't support a character idea. If you want someone to be a crazy inventor, then they won't have much to work with if the setting is stuck in the Middle Ages or the Classical era. If you want an antagonist to be a power-hungry warlord who strikes fools down with a single blow of his hammer, they aren't going to find much support if they live in modern-day Western Europe or North America. But even if you deliberately chose a particular era for your setting initially, that doesn't mean your setting is stuck in that era for all time. Maybe you could take a fantasy setting 100 years into the future and transform it into a grand Age of Sail setting with adventure and magic on the high seas. Maybe you could take a gritty cyberpunk setting 100 years into the future and turn it into a post-cyberpunk, post-human neo-noir setting. The rich are effectively immortal, and the poor are re-engineered into soulless worker drones. Now, there are some important downsides to this approach. First off, even if the setting is the same, you're still distancing yourself from its original concept, and not all of your audience members will be on board with that kind of change. Second, whether you move into the past or the future, moving the time frame involves making implicit promises about how events will turn out. If the new story is in the future, then you're promising that stories in the present will lead into that situation. If the new story is in the past, then you're promising that this story will lead to the present. These promises remove a certain kind of tension that you might have wanted to play around with, and more importantly, it may force your story into a corner you can't write your way out of, and that's not a good place to be. Number 6. Rewrite history. Something that's always important to remember is this: nothing about your setting is set in stone until the audience knows about it. That includes both future details about the plot that haven't happened yet, and past details about characters and nations that you haven't explained yet. And so when I say that you can rewrite your setting's history to insert a new character, I specifically mean the history that, as far as your audience knows, hasn't happened yet. For instance, let's say that your setting is about a handful of plucky kingdoms that band together to fight off a mighty empire. The empire is to the south, and the kingdoms are to the north. So what's north of the kingdoms? Well, you, the author, know that there's an impassable mountain range to the north, and beyond that is an inhospitable Arctic tundra. However, you've never described these mountains or what's beyond them in any of your works. So what if you want to introduce a northern barbarian who hails from the wastelands? Or what if you want to spice things up by having a horde of mounted archers descend on the kingdoms and conquer them all in a single summer? If you never said anything about the mountains or the tundra, then all you have to do is just make a couple revisions. The mountain range is passable, and the north is either a series of fjords where a Norse-like society lives, or a vast steppe full of nomadic tribes. It may feel strange to redesign your setting like this, but, and this is crucial, your audience will never know the difference. Number 7. Destroy the world. Back when Dungeons & Dragons converted from 1st to 2nd edition, they created an event for their Forgotten Realms setting called the Time of Troubles. During this time, gods walked the earth, pantheons got reshuffled, and the nature of spells changed forever. Then, when the system went from 3rd to 4th edition, they unleashed the Spell Plague. Magic changed again, nations appeared and vanished, new races got introduced or became more common, and the world as it was came to an end. Until it got mostly rebooted to the way it was before for 5th edition, because the changes weren't very popular. The point is that, while it is drastic, one thing you can do to change your setting is destroy it. Put your setting through an Armageddon event, which is something I've gone over in a previous video, and then rebuild it into some new shape that supports the kind of stories and characters you want to write now. The benefit of doing this is that you can maintain a certain level of continuity between the old and reborn settings, like the shape of continents, the way magic works, or whatever else you think is worth salvaging. The big downside is that the audience members who didn't want the old setting to die are going to hate you for killing it. Still, if you're the creator, then it's your setting, and you can do with it whatever you please. So whether you change a backstory to fit a setting or change a setting to fit a backstory, remember to have fun, and try not to make any decisions you'll regret. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.